Well, welcome to the Nautical Institute's webinar on toxic leadership. My name is Steve Window. I'm head of the Nautical Institute Academy, and I've been with the Nautical Institute since June of last year. If we can move on to the next slide, please. Nautical Institute, we're an international professional body, and our main role is to help members with professional development. We also represent members within the wider community with the likes of the IMO. And our main role is to share information informing best practice, both with and without our members, because professionals make better decisions, and they also make better decisions if they discuss things with their peers. Now, leadership, if you were to Google leadership definition, you'll have something like 7.8 million definitions of leadership. Toxic leadership falls within the leadership category. It's just one example of leadership, but we'll come on to that shortly. If you're not a member, my question to you is why not? And if you are a member, thanks anyway for your support, and we hope it's an enduring relationship that we have with you. Next slide, please. You should have a control panel to the right of your screen. Clearly, you've got that in front of you as part of the standard thing we go to webinar. There's a few controls you need to be aware of. On the left-hand side of the slide you see there, there's a mute button. You should be muted. You can send questions, which are the second slide, or second part of the tile on the left-hand side there, and they'll be coordinated by Samaya, who will then feed them on to myself and the panel. There's also a couple of downloads and the handouts that they're PDF format. You can take those away with you. And as you can see on the right-hand side there, the greatest impediment to mentoring. We'll be sending out poll questions during the course of the webinar for you to answer, to give us some feedback on what your thoughts are as we progress through. Next slide, please. And at the end, there's a short survey which we'd love you to fill in and send back, especially the how did we do bit, and you'll get a certificate of purely for CPD purposes, detailing that you've attended this webinar. It will also appear on social media towards the end of the week. What we do is after the end of the webinar, we'll edit it slightly just to tidy it up and then push it out via social media. Next slide. Right, the panelists. You can read and listen at the same time. I'll go through them in no particular order. We're starting off with Dr. Steve Price, ex-Royal Naval Reservist with a PhD in maritime science and a clinical hypnotherapist. It was actually Steve that introduced the concept of running this as a webinar because he has some interesting viewpoints that are very pertinent to self-help within the industry, and we'll discuss this during his slot. Captain Les Hesketh, experienced master mariner within the industry, came ashore and is taking a leading role within the training environment within UK. And Captain John Wright, again, significant experience as a master mariner, been ashore since the 90s and delivers training with safety being at its centre point. He's also a panel member on CHIRP, the charity there for the Confidential Hazardous Information Reporting Programme, and John takes a lead very much on the human element side of reducing accidents. Next slide, please. Then there's Wayne Kilby, a warrant officer within the Royal Marines, and Wayne delivers training on the human factor side of things and corporate culture. Tom Sharp, vast experience within the Royal Navy and now outside, and has an interesting story to tell, which will come on during his slot. And it's quite harrowing and shows the relationship between the ship and ashore and the support that can be offered from either side, and the barriers as well that come with that. And then Captain Don Cockrell, Port of London, ex-Port of London pilot, again, an expert within the industry, and he'll be starting the discussion with the master-pilot relationship and the issues of authority and assertiveness that come within. Next slide, please. There is the QR code there, and there's also a click here to follow us on LinkedIn. We have two websites on LinkedIn, or two sites on LinkedIn. There's the NI itself and the NI Academy. The NI deals with wider issues, the NI Academy is purely training. And next slide, please. Toxic leadership, and next slide. As I said earlier, there's 7.8 million definitions of leadership, and there's probably as many definitions as there are articles on the subject. This is probably the best definition of toxic leadership, in that it's nice and woolly, because what is toxic to one person may be good or beneficial for another. But it's any type of leadership that's destructive to members of a team in the overall workplace. It's fair to say that it's a selfish abuse of power on the part of the leader. It's focused on the leader and not the team. It's difficult to thrive in this sort of situation because you're continually watching your back and trust isn't there. It's fair to say that a toxic leader will have their own self-interest at heart, and that's going to affect the team's performance, their productivity and morale. It also has a significant impact upon safety, because people aren't open, people are scared. It's a toxic environment, and toxic leadership is that personified. Next slide, please. I'm now going to lead with, go back one, please. So I'm going to lead off with Don Cockrell, with his view of master-pilot relationship, his experience at sea, and the issue of authority and assertiveness. Don, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Good to be able to talk to you. I'm going to say a few words about pilotage, toxic leadership in pilotage. Unfortunately, it's not uncommon in pilotage that toxic leadership can be experienced, and it's often without the guilty party realizing they're even doing it. Sometimes even during the master pilot exchange. The pilot may have a rather strong, almost dictatorial manner in the way that he speaks to the master and the bridge team, which may cause them to not fully engage with the pilot during the pilotage act. And I just want to touch on a couple of reasons why that might be. Alternative situation could also happen when on boarding the ship and entering the bridge, the pilot finds that the master may or may not, without realizing it, or perhaps even intentionally, convey the impression to the pilot that the pilot's services are unnecessary or even unwelcome, despite the fact that the regulatory requirements require the pilotage to be compulsory. All of this, of course, does not encourage teamwork between all the parties involved on the bridge. It's worth mentioning here the matter of the master understanding what the legal status of a pilot is. There's a lot of confusion and misunderstanding on this. In other words, is the pilot simply an advisor to the master, as it can be in some places, or does the pilot have legal conduct of the navigation of the ship within pilotage waters? And this status is a matter of national or local legislation, varies from country to country, or even in some countries from port to port. If the pilot does have legal conduct, as for example is the case in the United Kingdom, that may be one reason why the pilot has an overbearing approach to conducting the pilotage act. It's not something which is encouraged, it's not something which is desirable, but it may happen. And the legal status of a pilot is an often overlooked or misunderstood aspect of pilotage, as I say, but it is an essential part of any properly prepared pilotage act, that the pilot, the master and the bridge team all understand what the pilot's legal status is, and thus how it might potentially affect their relationship and the way in which the pilot behaves. Of course, it might be that the master's own relationship with his or her bridge team is not as inclusive as it should be. And we all understand, I hope, that to be effective, the bridge team members at whatever level they are in the team, be they the master or be they the helmsman or a lookout or somewhere in between, one of the officers of the watch, that they are all effective members of the team, and that they feel free to question the master and the pilot if they have any doubt about orders or instructions that they've been given or what may be happening around the vessel. The good relationship between the pilot and the bridge team, not only the master is essential. Pilots and the team have only a few minutes to create an effective relationship, if you think about it, when the pilot comes on board. And thus it's essential that the pilot is not only confident in his greetings with the master and the bridge team, but also explains very briefly that input and questions from the master and the bridge team are welcome at every stage of the passage. Pilots and bridge teams need to recognize that pilots do make mistakes and they are not infallible, and they need to be supported and monitored by the rest of the members of the team in order to ensure the safety of a good passage. As I mentioned just now, the same issue of toxic leadership does of course apply to the relationship between the master and his bridge team. And my colleague, who's going to follow now, Les Hesketh, will address the aspects of that. Back to you, Steve.
Yeah, thanks for that, Don. So we've looked there with the issue of master pilot and the issue of, and introduced the issue of authority and assertiveness. And it's very interesting from the pilot point of view. It's a snapshot of a bridge team and their effectiveness from coming on board, and that building a relationship almost instantaneously over a few minutes before the pilot takes control. Now, handing over to Les to use that.
Yes. Good morning, mariners, or afternoon, wherever you are in this world. Dealing with command and dealing with an underperforming team, individuals without toxicity. Can I have slide 1, please? Slide 1. That's it. Thank you. Now, underperforming individuals or teams can be very disruptive in any organization. This is particularly important at sea, where it can lead to an unhappy ship and an increased risk of accidents. How you deal with it is important. You must not ignore it. Slide 2, please. The importance of dealing with an underperforming crew or individual is first, recognize the problem. Underperformance has to be dealt with as quickly as possible. Get to know the individual by name. Show a friendly face. Does the individual know that they are underperforming? Has the individual been told how he or she is underperforming? If possible, have a quiet face-to-face meeting in a neutral area, not in your cabin. Avoid emotional confrontation at all costs. Be specific. Explain the underperformance. Do not be vague. List the facts to avoid any emotional confrontation. Is the problem lack of training? Has the individual received face-to-face training? Has the training been explained, and is it understood? Explain what the job expectations are. Is it possible to formulate an action plan to help and check on improved performance? Are there any external factors affecting the performance? That's important, external factors. Is it due to poor communication on board? Now, communication can be a common problem, not only on the ship, but also ashore. Believe me, I've had that experience. With a follow-up, it often helps to give praise when a rectification or a job has been well done. Have slide 3, please. A good master will be a listening master, but also firm but fair. You cannot demand respect. You have to earn it. It is the master's job to try and develop a team spirit on the ship to avoid underperforming crews. We're all mariners, and good communication on board ship is paramount. Thank you. Over to Tom now.
Yeah, thanks, Les. It's a very interesting point you came out with there in terms of the building an underperforming team. In that, I'm sure we've all come across somebody that said, "Oh, myself and the master never really got on. It was a personality issue." Whereas a good leader will inspire people and work with them to build them up as well as getting the task done. Now, introducing Tom, who will give a case study on his experience at sea back from 2004. Tom, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Steve. Yes, I had the unfortunate task of presenting the rather gloomy side of this, having been on the receiving end of a bully in 2004 in HMS Somerset. I was the operations officer, so third in command, when this officer was appointed to us as a known toxic leader, or was he? I'll come back to that in a second. But it became very clear to us shortly after he joined that his modus operandi was fear and recrimination rather than mentoring and consolidation. Time prevents me from giving too many anecdotes that would bring this to life, but there are some absolute crackers. For example, he wanted one sailor court-martialed for cowardice in the face of the enemy because she failed to fire her weapon on time when we were trying to defend the oil platforms in the Northern Gulf. I personally had my headset ripped off me and was dismissed from the ops room for trying to alert the officer of the watch to a steady bearing situation, again in the Northern Gulf. And I was interrupting him. Of course, I didn't know that. We were separated by 5 decks, but I had the temerity to interrupt him to prevent this collision, and had the headset ripped from me and was dismissed from the ops room, even though we were in operation in ops control. So it became very, very difficult to work with very quickly. It was surprising how fast this toxicity took hold. Interestingly, the junior officers, of course, were particularly targeted. There were a few senior ratings who were targeted on the bridge and in the ops room, but predominantly it was the junior officers and the senior officers to an extent as well. But we spent most of our time trying to work out what to do about it. One of the things we did very early on was we adopted lines to take. Extraordinarily, me and my contemporaries, we knew we would be quizzed on the situation wherever we went, and we adopted actually defensive lines to take to defend him, to defend his behavior, which is extraordinary when I think back to it, but it goes to show the defensive mindset that one can get into in a complex hierarchical organization, and we were certainly that in a warship about to deploy to the Gulf. We tried to alert the system on a number of occasions. In fact, I mean, of course, I discussed it personally with the captain on 4 different occasions, each of which went progressively worse as time went by. So we tried to alert various organizations. Flag Officer Sea Training, which is our large training organization down in Plymouth, potentially have the teeth to identify this kind of behavior and take action, but failed to do so, and in fact endorsed his behavior as driving us hard, ready to go to a very high threat theatre. So we left there rather dismayed that no one seemed to be listening to us. The flotilla, our sort of parent organization, again really paid no heed to our concerns. In fact, sometimes it backfired. I called the captain of the flotilla, so one up from our captain, and shut the door on him to say something needs to be done or people are going to break. And he went back, reported a clean bill of health, and reported on me to the captain before he left the ship. So we were felt very much like we were on our own throughout this 6, 7, 8, 9 month period, of which 8 months was up in the oil platforms in the Northern Gulf. So very tense anyway, and really felt like there was nowhere to turn. Eventually, of course, what happens next is people start to break, and that happened. We had one officer ashore on leave who had a mental breakdown, and then it became apparent that another officer on board was pretty much heading the same way, and these people were my responsibility. So at that point, it became apparent that the quiet word that we'd been having up until then wasn't working, so something more drastic needed to be done. I called the sea training legal advisor, someone I didn't know, and took what I considered to be personal risk at the time doing so, because I assumed that this information would find its way out of the system, and that would be the end of my career. Nevertheless, I called the FOST legal advisor, and thus was set in train a series of processes and questions and interviews that ultimately provided his demise. Once the seal was broken, it happened very quickly, and in fact, in the end, we were all invited to write statements. All the officers were invited to write statements, and a few of the key senior ratings, and it was that that did for him. So after a year approximately. So I'll finish off with a couple of points, and perhaps even a question. The first one was, how was it that everybody in the Navy knew, and yet somehow nobody knew, or was listening, or wanted to listen, or was paying attention? How does that situation come about? He was often referred to as a good man to go to war with by people senior to him. Absolutely incorrect. And in fact, what did for him in the end wasn't so much his toxic behavior, it was more the substandard performance that drove within his subordinates. In other words, we were standing into danger as a ship because people were becoming so scared to do their jobs, they were becoming ineffective. And I think that triggered the system perhaps more than the toxicity. And then the final question, which is one I've wrestled with personally ever since, was how much did he know he was doing this? I have not resolved that in my own mind, but perhaps one we can bring up in discussions later. Steve, that's me complete. Thank you.
Lovely, thanks, Tom. Now, there's an academic called John Adair who has his action-centered leadership model. And imagine a Venn diagram of 3 circles that have a sweet spot in the center. The first one is the task, the second one is the team, and the third one is the individual. And where those 3 elements interact is the sweet spot for leadership. Now, the thing with toxic leadership is that it can be highly effective. And studies have shown that it can be highly effective for periods of up to 2 years before the wheels come off, and it can be far sooner than that. Now, from Tom's story, you can join a Royal Naval ship, for example, and be on board for 18 months to 2 years. In the Merchant Navy, you can be on board a ship for 6 months. If the master's on board for 6 months, that toxicity can be largely hidden. But it's at the cost of the team and the individual. And as Tom rightly pointed out there and clearly pointed out, the effect on the ship's team was catastrophic, purely through this toxic leadership style that was being displayed by the captain. Now, what happens when it goes wrong? Now I'm going to introduce us to Dr. Steve Price, and who will deal with the issues of how to pick up the pieces. Steve, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Steve. I come to this story having grown up with a toxic leader who was a former instructor officer at HMS Ganges. And I didn't endure 2 years, I endured 54 years. And out of that did flow some issues for me, which I found were helped by therapy, ultimately. And it was that which prompted me then to turn my attention to becoming a therapist, such that I could help others. I was that impressed with it. I'm not making any claims. I'm not a mental health expert. I'm not a psychotherapist. I'm not a psychologist. But I'm also a seafarer. And the parallels between my experience and those particularly of Tom, for instance, are profound. Now, the first slide, please. So a toxic leader is enjoying a kind of ego trip. It's a cloud cuckoo land of power, and they are skilled manipulators and skilled at drawing attention to themselves. Unfortunately, the consequences of their toxic leadership will leave a debt in the future which has to be repaid by others. As we've said before, the effectiveness short term can be seductive and lead to organizations tolerating toxic leadership because it gets results. Next slide, please. Nevertheless, there comes a crisis point, which may well be a human resources problem, or possibly even a serious accident. And there are inevitably criminal and civil legal implications which have to be extracted from that point of crisis. Next slide, please. So when we're investigating, exploring, or as it were, firefighting with toxic leadership, it takes a lot of experience and a degree of compassion, both for victims and perpetrator, would you believe, to start to create the solution space, which I think in other language might be called a healing environment, out of which we can gather evidence and establish where the legal boundaries fit. Next slide, please. So when we are at sea, we're all human, we're all under stress, we all have our individual and personal experiences of how things should be done. And making and keeping things safe for people does require disciplined self-compassion. And to that end, we need to create resources both for ourselves and for our teams which allow that to happen. In Tom's case, it was the absence of an effective back channel to communicate back to the fleet, which took a lot of discipline to actually create. So Tom had to create a back channel for communication before he could even use it. And that's something to be looked at by all of us for the future. At an individual level, my advice to seafarers that I find myself mentoring is that they should essentially keep a diary. Diaries are valuable, both as a source of personal reflection and as a source of evidence. Next slide, please. If you do aspire to becoming a leader, I would strongly recommend that you engage with some kind of relaxed, therapeutic, and reflective resource as part of your personal development. And that can go anywhere from finding a mentor to, in fact, going and getting some therapy with a qualified professional such as myself to find the self-compassion that will help you find compassion for other people. Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Steve. Second poll question is now on the streets for answering. And one thing I think we need to take away from this is going back to the Adair model there, the task, the team, the individual. We've looked at the task, we've looked at the individual side with Steve Price, and it's important to look after your own mental health, especially when you're confronted with toxic leadership in your immediate vicinity. And it's the aftermath that is the critical part. Now, what can we do about this apart from the individual? We need to look at the corporate culture. So Wayne Kilby will be next up with the Shell C model. Wayne, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Steve. Next slide. Next slide. Brilliant. Thank you very much. We've looked at human factors at some depth now within the organisation, and we've introduced a human factors system. Introducing our human factors system, we have to give everybody a base layer model to work from. That base model that we ask everyone to look at and overlay to many areas looks like this. Next slide, please. Back one. There you go. That's brilliant. Which is the Shell Model C. A lot of people on the call will recognise this model. It's quite a well-known model, and it's used through many industries. Within this Shell model, we'll look at our software, our hardware, ergonomics and design, the environment to which people are working in, and also the liveware, which is the others, and you, very much you, at the centre of the model. And if people are aware of this model and employ this model, then the circle that surrounds the model is our behaviour, and therefore we'll be able to identify where people's thinking is at. Next slide, please. Now, if there is toxic leadership present within the workplace, which is part of the liveware within our organisation, if that toxic leadership is being demonstrated and being employed, then the people within that sphere, within that environment of those people working in, will feel that they have no influence at all over their concerns within their workplace. So just click, please, so the arrows move, please, or not. Okay, so the more toxic leadership that's present, the less influence I feel I have in my workplace over my concerns. However, if there is good leadership present and demonstrated by my leadership, which I am listened to by my leadership and empowered by my leadership, and more importantly, acted upon my input to my leadership, then therefore I feel my say will grow over my concerns. And therefore, if I feel I have more influence in the workplace, I will offer more to my leaders around my concerns, which more than likely are the same concerns as those leaders in dealing with the tasks which they've got. Next slide, please. If there is toxic leadership present, then those problems, those concerns are most definitely 100% to those individuals in the workplace, regardless of what position you are within that workplace. However, if we do include human factors within the workplace and expose our leaders of what their behaviours are, we will most definitely change some of that thinking. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So where we see here is the rank structure at the moment in time within the Royal Navy and the Royal Marines. The 100% problem, which is on the right-hand side, reverts down to the Marine, the able seaman at the bottom. That 100% problem, if that's pulsing away, that'll affect their behaviour, it'll affect their performance, it'll affect their mental health, which will then affect their output within the organisation. However, if our leaders engage within human factors, at each level rank within that rank structure, there should be issues, their concerns, their problems from 100% down to say 20%. When it gets to the 20%, if that's going level for 1SL, 2SL, who are senior leaders of our organisation, then they're dealing with concerns or issues that are a 20%, 30% problem, not a 100% problem. So we need to look at our leadership, identify where the behaviours are not beneficial for our organisation and influence change. In other words, allowing our people to speak up, listening to our people and acting on our people. And if we do that, then the benefits to our organisation are very, very worthwhile. And therefore our human performance increases, our organisation's productivity increases, and our organisation's reputational increase as well. And I do believe that's me, Steve. Thank you.
Lovely, thanks, Wayne. This ties in quite neatly with the issue of individual and corporate. And the corporate culture has to be such that it supports the individual, but also allows the leadership and the higher leadership to function correctly. I'm going to move on to John Wright next. John is looking at the issue of what type of leadership is best for the industry. And it's an emotive subject. I mean, we've all come across, I'm sure, people who operate still under the system of master under God. And it's and the problems that are associated with that. You can't talk to that individual because they are indeed higher beings. So John, over to you, sir.
Yes, good morning, afternoon, evening to everyone. So we've been looking at in the Maritime Professional Council, which is a body that's made up of various organisations, including the Nautical Institute, the Honourable Company and others. And we've been looking at kind leadership, and sometimes people find that a little woolly, so let me just read you one definition which I think is informative. A kind leader may be defined as someone who thinks about their people, wants to work, what motivates them, what interests in what motivates them, what inspires them. They focus on who the individual is and how they can help them become the best person they can be, while acknowledging that people have a life away from their ship or office as well as other responsibilities. It goes on, but that's the essence of it. And this comes from the Forbes Business Council, but there's various definitions. So we asked in our market research about this subject, and if I can have the first slide, please. And the next. We asked that question. Not only did we ask that question in our first tranche of market research, which included various bodies, people ashore, mariners, and what have you, and we did a preliminary report. We then went on to ask the Nautical Institute volunteered to ask industry more widely. So we had 119 responses from mariners from 27 countries, and at age groups from 18 to 65. So a pretty wide scope, and pretty much unanimity in some of the answers across cultures and across age groups, which was interesting. But we're still in the middle of analysing all that, because at the end of the day, we want this to be more than just a talking exercise. We want to take it to where we advance ideas as how it can be taken forward in the industry. So that's the first thing we asked. Next, please. We asked that. Interestingly, most people, even without the definition, were pretty au fait with the kind leadership. It didn't seem to faze them, and we had some great answers. Again, a lot of unanimity. Next, please. And we asked that too, because, and that we have in common with the Nautical Institute. I'm a member, so I'm really delighted to see the Nautical Institute taking a lead. In the questionnaire or survey of the mariners through the Nautical Institute, the 119 responses, which looked at strengths and opportunities involved with this, and weaknesses and threats, as well as STCW and leadership training. The responses were not only, they were really impressive, let me say. It just confirms what I've always thought. If you want to know the answer to what could be a knotty problem, then ask the troops, ask the people both ashore and afloat what the problem is and how we can fix it. And we are now we now have custody of some amazing advice, and we'll be moving forward with this to see if we can't get the industry off top dead center. Next, please. These were some of the just a selection of some of the feedback, the first lot of feedback. I won't read it out. I'll let you have a look. But you'll see there's a theme. That STCW bare minimum thing was, and that it's very much just a process, was borne out by our second bigger survey. As you can see from the top middle, well, you can see for yourself, there's threads which very much fit in with the first presenters here today, who've all shown you what happens and how it happens when all of these things, or many of them, are missing in action, as I found for myself as a young officer years ago. Next, please. There's a bigger presentation, but this are some of the conclusions from our first survey. These are quotes as opposed to our opinions. Graduated leadership, I mean, a lot of opinion about it being something that's woven into our training from a cadet onwards was pretty much spoken about by across the board. How it needs to be developed. It won't happen, you know, you won't go to sleep, ladies and gentlemen, and in the morning the fairies have delivered leadership skills under the pillow. Not going to happen, sorry. So this is the sort of thing we got, and looking at best practice. The overall flavor of where we're going is to try to give some advice to the industry through the Maritime Professional Council and these various bodies, to give a roadmap or a passage plan for how we take hopefully get the industry leaders to adopt the roadmap, make it their own, and take us forward on this. Because it's the antithesis of toxic leadership, and we're trying to see if we can't march it forward with your help. And as I said, the quality of the feedback from 119 mariners, both ashore and afloat, across cultures, which would interest you, I know, across cultures and across age groups, was awesome. It was humbling. So I hope I'm giving you some reason to believe we might take the industry forward and not just wallow in this sad, I wouldn't say norm, but in this sad world where toxic leadership still thrives. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Lovely, thanks, John. The next poll question's out there. Can we avoid toxic leaders? Straightforward yes or no, but there's far more to it than that, and we'll go into that in the question and answer session now. Now, I've got one question that's been submitted, which is what is the best route to get the industry to adopt a kind leadership culture? Now, we currently train under STCW, and we start with training cadets. We can't come from industry and be captain of a ship. We have to start from the very beginning. So any form of training of the individual has to be done at multi-layers. We can't just deal with cadets coming in, because that'll take 10, 15 years before those cadets become masters. Do we therefore need to train masters at the same time that we train cadets? And then similarly, do we need to bring the leadership culture into the organizations concurrently? So the question there, how do we adopt kind leadership culture within industry? And I'll throw that one over to, first of all, John, and then Wayne.
Well, there are pockets. It's not just one big disaster zone, but the feedback has been pretty unanimous in saying we need this and we need the training, and SDCW isn't providing it. So we do have it in pockets, but it's a long road to go. Let's just say that.
Okay, Wayne, your position as a trainer.
I think from people, what you've got to recognise that people come joining the industry, they're going into that level of profession straight away, will bring their own skills with them, and it's identifying what level of skill they automatically bring with them, so they'll learn behaviours, and some of them might be toxic and some of them might be very good to start with. So I think it's very much identifying the people when they come in at that level, what skills they're going to bring, and then what their skills are going to bring if their learned behaviours are not in line with the thinking of the organisation around having good leadership and good fellowship, then there most definitely will be required a training or being exposed to a different way of thinking. Does that help, Steve?
Yeah, it helps a great deal. And John, when can we access the survey results from your work?
Sorry, I didn't catch the question.
Yeah, sorry, John. When can we access the results from your work that you've been doing?
Okay, so where we are is Professor Carol Davis is helping us to put all the material into a final report in a manner that's acceptable to all, we hope, because she is an academic and very experienced in that. So I'm not sure about a date, but somewhere in the next quarter we should have a final report. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Now, one of the things, the themes we've had coming up this morning is we've looked at toxic leadership at sea, and we've looked at a very hierarchical system with the Royal Navy as an example in our case study. And another question I have is the issue of uniform at sea and the artifacts of that you wear stripes on your shoulders, etc. Does that reinforce toxic leadership, or does it act as a barrier to leadership, or is it a good thing? And I'll take your view first, Tom.
I think you have to look at why uniform developed in the way it did, and I think in the Royal Navy it's specifically because you have to make life or death decisions, or at least possibly impose them on other people. And certainly the World War II and before submarine examples of ships that got rid of uniforms generally had higher rates of insubordination and loss of efficiency. That's not widely published, but I think that's the case. So no, I think uniform isn't really the issue here. I think it can be used as an excuse, and rank can certainly be used as an excuse. I think that's probably more of an issue than actually all wearing the same clothes. I mean, I wouldn't endorse not wearing uniform. I guess I probably would say that. It's not that. It's the person and occasionally hiding behind the rank that's more of an issue.
Yeah, sure. Don, what's your take on this as a pilot? The issue of uniform.
Two perspectives on it, really. One of them, as a pilot boarding the ship, having a group of people on the bridge of the ship with no discernible indication of what their actual role might be can be a little bit challenging sometimes. Quite often, it's not or it will be unusual for the master not to be recognisable from the bridge team, but quite often, you try to work out who everybody else is and what their role is. I mean, the helmsman is quite obvious because he's steering the ship, but other people, sometimes if you've got sort of 3 or 4 members in the bridge team, it can be a little bit confusing. The other aspect, I think, is I would agree with Tom. I'm not so sure it's the uniform itself. It comes back to the background training as to how people behave with their rank. The indication of rank is probably essential within as a reminder to those concerned and for visitors and outsiders such as pilots to understand who's who. But it's not so much the dress. So practical boiler suits on hard-working ships works very well as long as it's got a badge to say who that person is and what their role is.
Yeah, sure. Now, one of the themes that's come out throughout each of the presentations is the issue of moral courage and moral leadership, and actually being that person that says enough. So the next question from the floor is that bravery is key to success in terms of dealing with toxic leaders. How can we empower crews and teams not to be bystanders? And that one I will throw over to John.
Well, I have to tell you that that the question is round the wrong way. With all respect, it has to come from the leader. It's not for nothing that the aircraft flew into a mountainside, and at the beginning of CRM, cockpit resource management, people were saying, well, that's not logical. Why would the first officer do that, knowing the captain was making haulix of it, a complete? And the answer is you cannot overcome in those circumstances, or is very difficult to overcome, the authority gradient. And that was the birthplace of CRM, such that it became not only acceptable, but required that the first officer would speak up if the captain was flying, and vice versa if it was the first officer flying. And that went up and up and into our profession and others, nuclear and others. So it stems from the leader. He has to be trained, and frankly, the best way to do that is through experiential learning and the use of simulators, so that he actually experiences in a safe environment the consequences of those sorts of errors.
Well, thanks, John. Now, I'm going to variation on that one in terms of if you have a toxic leader, you're working under them, you don't have another avenue. How do you deal with that? And I'll ask you that, I'll ask Les that question. How do you deal as an individual with a toxic leader that you have no other avenue to challenge through?
Yes, a very good question. Having experienced a toxic leader when I was chief mate, there's certainly what you've got to avoid is confrontation. He's the master of the ship. You might be a junior officer, chief officer, or even a seaman. I followed the master's instructions, but drop hints occasionally, or don't question, but suggest another way of doing things. You have to be a bit of a diplomat, I suppose, at sea. And a lot of us mariners, we're not diplomats, we're not politicians, and we do sort of head things straight off or straight in, the Rockweiler sort of effect. But you have to try and be a little bit diplomatic, and it is difficult working under a toxic leader. When you paying off the ship, you always say, oh, thank you very much, Captain, and don't insult the man. He's still the position in command. You just have to, I suppose, grin and bear it in some respects, but be diplomatic and try and suggest things to him. I think that's all you can do. Maybe Steve might have a better idea about it.
Yeah, Steve, what's your view?
I think we need to talk about power, because a toxic leader likes to think they have power over a situation. And my experience of command was that I had very little power over the situation. I did have quite a bit of power in relation to the situation. And then whatever that power was potentially something I might use as a last resort, but in general, it's the power of connection between people. So as let's say somebody in a vulnerable position, they can start to reclaim some power for themselves by connecting with other crew members who may have more experience or be able to mentor and coach them through their relationship difficulties with, say, a toxic leader. And finding power within yourself, like I said before, having your own diary, being able to collect evidence slowly but surely, have some personal emotional support, find it somewhere on board, or find it within yourself in terms of mental health first aid resources, can be invaluable in terms of just keeping you safe until you finally get to the end of the trip and you can put both feet on dry land.
Lovely, thanks, Steve. Now, there's a question that always comes out with leadership: is it nature or nurture? Now, I'll nail my colours to the wall and say that because nobody's identified the leadership gene in the DNA profiles, that it's got to be through nurture, and nature is immaterial. So the question from the floor again is: are toxic leadership behaviours something that can be unlearned, or is that person effectively a narcissistic personality that you can't rationalise against? Dave.
Should I challenge that one, Steve, please?
Yes, please, Wayne. Yeah.
People's personality traits are always their learned behaviours. Now, their learned behaviours to their personality is probably coming from their parents. So if their parents have been leaders in the past and they've been toxic leaders, they will influence the same behaviour through their children, and therefore they'll get that learned behaviour. It's when they join our organisation we then challenge that thinking, that behaviour. That individual needs to mentally process what is right and what is wrong. And try to come to terms with their behaviours that they've had all their life. Might not necessarily be the correct behaviours, so therefore you can influence and change them. John mentioned very much about the simulator and doing those learned environments and testing that experience by putting those people through those scenarios and then challenging their thinking through those scenarios. Only then will they start to realise that the behaviour that they've been a part of their personality might not necessarily be the correct personality for that environment which they're working in. Does that help?
Yeah, it's great, Wayne. John?
Building on that, I found that when you had exercises, even when you conducted them well, they found their own mistakes on the simulator, the debrief being the most important. You got their colleagues to comment on what went well and not so well. And the master and his team, all of the above, and they would leave the course often in this sort of, right, I've got it, sort of mode. However, I'm here to tell you folks that that's nowhere near enough. I have experienced such that if you do not convince the client shipping company that they need to mentor those behaviors in, you have got no chance, and your training dollars go straight down the loo. Why? Because a master or chief, for example, will go back on the ship, not because he's a bad person, but he will be subsumed by the prevailing culture on board. And 6 weeks after he felt so passionately about the training he's received and his performance that he had conducted so well, he will have reverted to type. So it takes a company to say, these are the behaviors we require. Now, how are we going to make sure that these are the adopted behaviors? We're going to send our trained mentors on board. Now, this could be a ship superintendent who's been trained to do other jobs, so it can be cost effective. But one of them is to be the fly on the wall on the bridge and to have a debrief with the old man or the chief and explain what went well and what not so well and seek what support he needs. But the interesting thing then is that everybody in the company realized that, oh my God, I better shape up or I'm going to be invited to ship out, because this is the prevailing culture and people will come to the party, and it's the only way you'll get an entire company of like-minded people, and the culture flips, and you have it's the way we do things around here. and then the training dollars have been well spent.
Yeah.
Not until.
Don.
Yes, okay. Yeah, just to actually to qualify what John has just been explaining, is something that pilots come across very frequently. You can train pilots into the human factor side, the pilotage BRM aspects of things, and that goes on an awful lot now amongst pilot organisations around the world. But it is not uncommon to take all that background and training, and you go onto on board a ship, and even though you know that the ship staff would have gone through STCW BRM training at least once, that's another issue as well. But it gets eroded away, and probably for exactly the reasons that John's saying. So then what happens is, after you've done a few ships like that, you begin to throw your hands up in the air and say, well, what's the point? You know, you've got to get the job done as safely as you possibly can. So that then has a negative effect on the manner in which the pilots operate, which is why I mentioned when I was speaking that quite often the people concerned don't even realise they're doing it. They're just subsumed into the cultures that prevail.
Yeah, thanks, Don. The next question: does the office and the shore have more of a role to play in handling toxic leaders and seeking feedback from juniors to detect and deal with toxic leaders in a safe way? So, should the shore side be far more interactive? And again, John, I see your head nodding there with a big smile. It's down to you again.
Well, absolutely. I mean, you hear every time I ran training for 25 years, these are experienced and good officers. They basically want to come to training and learn and move on, and they're good people. And within the first day, they would say, John, I'm starting to get the message of what this training is all about. So why are our bosses not sitting here with us? I promise you that was absolutely a guaranteed question I'd be asked every single time. And I had to say, well, we encourage it. Some of the time they did, to be fair. They sent a superintendent or two, and it worked really well, because it is, after all, a team game. And I used to say to the mariners, ashore is not where the baddies live and all the goodies live on the ships. Au contraire, we have to appreciate each other and appreciate that we're running a team game. But that's the essence of it. And so often you can drive a very large double-decker bus between the team ashore and the team on the ship. And that's not healthy, and it isn't good business, by the way. One of the things I forgot to say in my presentation is when you adopt this kind leadership and all the behaviors we're discussing now, it's the most efficient way to improve your business I've ever heard of. It really does improve what you're in business for, profit, as well as everyone feeling that they're working for a thinking, feeling company.
Yeah, thanks, John. Les?
Yeah, I agree with you there, John. How many shipping companies today, though, actually call the master up, or they can't invite them into the office? I know, I appreciate that, because the office might be the Far East or somewhere. But how many offices or manning agencies actually call, say, the master of the ship up and say, you're joining blah, blah, blah. The ship is en route. We've had problems on board. This is your cargo. Or we've had no problems on board. Do they actually talk to the master about the ship and the crew? In a way, they should be like a mentor to the master, because that's his fallback. I'm a great believer in mentoring with cadets, because I think mentoring starts at the bottom. You cannot mentor halfway up the tree. You've got to start at the bottom, and you've got to sort out the good mentors from the bad mentors, because the worst thing you can do is give a cadet a bad mentor. But there again, I go back. What is the communication like between, say, crew members on board the ship? The office must know. If they don't, then there's something falling down very, very quickly. I think that's important. The other thing I'd say was communication with the pilot. Yeah, from what Don's saying, that's most important. I've seen it on some ships where the pilot comes on and nobody talks. It's clamped up. I think it's disastrous. Bottom line to all this is mentoring, and leadership is about influencing the behavior of others. You can't lead without followers, and leaders have got to be trusted and respected, and that's the key. And again, it's communication between not just on board the ship, but the ship and the shore. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Les. One last question, and drawing upon your years of experience collectively, how would you prepare yourself as a seafarer when you know you're rejoining a vessel that has a toxic leader? I'll start there with Don, from the years of experience.
It's it's a difficult question for me to answer, to be frank. It's a long time since I actually worked on a ship as in a seagoing capacity, despite 30 years of pilotage. But I think what you have to do is think about what you're going into, and from a pilotage point of view, with a difficult master that you assess in the first few seconds of being on the bridge sometimes, is you need to form yourself some sort of diplomatic skill and be prepared to if you like, nurture the relationship, which may start off very difficultly, and maybe that's a way that seafarers could potentially think the same way. That is to not go in being prepared, if you like, to take a diplomatic stance rather than necessarily going in with a hard view. That would be my perspective.
Okay, great, Don. So it's nurturing that relationship and avoiding confrontation.
Yes, exactly.
Brilliant, thanks. Les, your view. You're muted, sir.
Apologies, I was muted. You cannot have confrontation on board the ship. If I was told I was joining as a commander master, joining a ship that had been a toxic leader on board, you've got to stand back and look at how the crew are performing. You can't just go straight in. If I was, well, I'll say, yeah, relieving a toxic master would be the easiest one to describe. Stand back when you join the ship. He's going to hand over to you. You accept it. No confrontation. I would hope that he would then be called into the office and asked to explain certain things, which might be, say, in a diary or on record that somebody has sent to him. And you've got to stand back as master of your new ship, and you've got to say, how are the crew performing? You won't be able to do it overnight. You've got to spend at least, say, 4 or 5 days, depending on how experienced you are as a master. And then you've got to start building the bricks up from the bottom upwards again to get the team working together.
Thanks, Les. Tom, from your own experience there and how you dealt with it, would you do it again?
I would, and you've just got to be able to deal with the individual, right? You've got to work out what the source of the toxicity is and try your best to manage it. In my case, it was almost comical the way I did it, because I couldn't make decisions without being accused of getting ahead of myself. And if I didn't make decisions, I was weak. I would go in with 2 options, and eventually got to the point where I'd recommend the option that I didn't want to do. So I would get shouted at and we would do the other thing. So it's almost comical. Of course, it wasn't funny at all at the time. But I then ran into leaders later on who were, not quite as bad, but had toxic traits. And you've really just got to, as everyone has said, be non-confrontational, try and get to the source of what's caused this, noting that the system has already endorsed this behavior for them quite a few times. So it's probably too late. And then just try and manage it as best as you can internally.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. And because we're conscious of the time here, I'm going to cut straight to Steve Price there in terms of, again, the same question again, how do you prepare yourself as a seafarer? How do you look after yourself, Steve?
I would strongly recommend you take a diary with you. Know who your friends are. In preparation, perhaps watch 1 or 2 YouTube videos on managing a toxic boss, and have some mental health resources on you, such as knowing how to do guided meditation. And there's an excellent technique called self-havening, which allows you to de-arouse painful emotions more or less in the heat of the moment. And they allow you to look a toxic boss in the eye and say, for instance, I just haven't got time at the moment for that problem. I'll get back to you, and avoid confrontation.
Yeah, and again, that requires moral courage, doesn't it?
It does indeed.
Any other aspects you feel we should deal with? I think with that,
I think if you go on your ship, that ship you've described, my advice to a junior officer or a younger officer is to run your watch in the manner that you wish the old man ran the ship, and at least in that you'll be demonstrating to the seafarers working with you that that's how it's done. And I can't add anything more to what my colleagues have said in terms of how you deal with the old man, with the captain.
yeah, sure. And Wayne, to finish off with.
I think within CRM, and I think there's quite a bit we can take from CRM. One of the things that we've taken and started to apply within the workplaces is giving those people the tool that when they do assertive behaviour, the individual that they're applying the tool to mentally processes and recognises that the individual in front of them is reasonably challenging them correctly, and therefore by disrupting their thinking then allows them to have that proper level conversation rather than it getting to the confrontation or the emergency stage. But the confrontation and the emergency stage is most definitely required and part of that tool set to use if you've used all the other tools in the box. So that's the only place you can go and react to. But then once you've gone to that emergency and challenge phase, is then afterwards having the organisation the avenue for you to escalate the data on what you found, so as that the organisation can identify lessons to learn, put that into its leadership training to avoid it happening again.
Lovely, thanks, Wayne. Well, that effectively wraps up the webinar for this session on toxic leadership. We hope that it's been useful for you and it's given you some cause for thought. Certainly there are probably far more questions than there are answers on this whole subject of dealing with a toxic leader. And the biggest question is really, how do we develop leadership training going forward within the industry? It's got to be a multi-layered effect. It's going to be a multi-pronged effect, both with the companies, with the individuals, and the individuals of each rank. So it's tackled not consecutively, but concurrently across every aspect that leadership is required. So thanks very much indeed for turning up. Hope you attend our next webinar, and you can follow us on LinkedIn, use the QR code shown, and hopefully hear some more from you soon. Thanks very much indeed.